morning. Good morning. Hello. Right. How was it? Oh, he's okay. She's wonderful. She is. Good. Well, ours was canceled. Good morning, Alex. He told me it was so good. I said, Gloria. Oh, you're so welcome. How's that? How are you? Is this your second retreat?
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
Okay, it's 11 o'clock. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our planning retreat. A few comments. This retreat, our 2022 Town Council retreat, will really focus on the 5 goals identified in the town's mission statement, and we've outlined them in the agenda. We'll use these goals as a reference point for our discussions as we plan for 2022. The first refers to the critical important goal of ensuring the protection of the community's residential character. The impact annexation and zoning have on any community, clearly including ours, is a key component to that goal and will be a focus for the discussion this morning. Since annexation and zoning are such complicated and complex issues, today's discussion will not be the only time we will talk about them. We will address them. We have scheduled 2 additional meetings, and there will be more information sent about those. We have scheduled February the 8th and February the 22nd, both of which to start at 10 a.m. to talk about annexation and zoning. The February 8th meeting will be a continuation of today's discussion, and if we're wherever we're at, to be able to conclude what we were unable to complete today. And we are doing this in a workshop fashion. So it will allow the town administrator and attorney to review and develop any documentation and language for council review. The meeting on February the 22nd will be completely in a town hall format. So we will provide the community members an opportunity to share their thoughts, perspectives on the discussions, what they've heard, the direction the council and staff are moving towards. So the 8th and the 22nd, if you wish to put those on your calendar. I encourage residents to listen, share their observations with the town administrator, Stephanie Tillerson, so that they can be responded to as part of the public input process. Comments can be submitted at any time and do not need to be held until the 22nd. So we will be sending out additional information on these meetings and future communications. So again, please put them on your calendar. Please feel free to share anything that you think. Town Council has been asked by the Community Association to, quote, review the issues and give consideration on proposed amendments, quote, that have been prepared by Kiowa residents. And we received that on the 9th of December. I wish to thank the residents that took their time to prepare the proposed amendments and changes. That was we appreciate what you did. Today's agenda and format were prepared in response to that request from the Community Association. On January the 4th, we received a petition from Kiowa residents to support to, quote, amend, modify, and clarify Section 12-79, and also add conditions to Section 12-155 for Town Council to consider before approving the planned development rezoning application. Specifically, in 12-79, there are 5 proposed changes, and in 12-159, there are 10 proposed changes. So today, Stephanie, Joe, will be going through these proposed changes. We'll go through them one by one. They'll share their thoughts and comments. I want to emphasize the importance of the subject before us and take the necessary time to understand community concerns before any decisions are made. I encourage council to listen, ask questions, to gain as broad an understanding of the implication of any proposed changes during our discussion. We will work towards having all language changes completed by February 22nd, if possible. We could potentially review the first, if we could do that. And I say if, because there's really no rush. It is important to get this language the way we think the community, we think the way it's supposed to work. We could potentially have the first reading in March. But otherwise, we will schedule additional workshops, additional town hall meetings in March, and then we'll just roll it out and have the first reading, whether it's in April. Again, there's nothing pressing. We just need to get this correct. It is imperative that the community and future councils are confident that we took the necessary time to assess and prepare any changes to these ordinances in responding to any future application for annexation. So, Stephanie?
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. Joe and I, along with the assistance of John Taylor, who is our planning manager, have looked at our current ordinance that you referenced, 12-79 and 12-159, in reference to some of the comments we received from the community. What we're going to spend over the next 2 hours, and like you said, we need to roll this over to February 8th, we will do so as well. But what we've done is we've looked at some of the suggested changes, which are, some are great, fantastic. We definitely will incorporate them into whatever language we come up with. And some we may have had some concerns, or maybe we're not able to address them in the language that they put in place. But we feel confident that ultimately the end goal, once we're done with this process, however long it takes, is really to create more community input, community engagement, allow our planning staff to do the work that they need to do along with the Planning Commission and Council. So with that, as you pointed out, Joe and I are going to go through some of the suggested changes, and we will provide our comments. One of the things I would also like to point out that we've talked about is that our annexation section in the zoning ordinance really hasn't been tested. I think from what I've heard that we maybe have only had 2 annexation applications for the town of Kiowa. One was this particular location, and the other one was Freshfields. Freshfields already built out, so that was I think a fairly easy annexation. So when this section was put in place, I'm not sure when it was put in place, but it's probably now, of course, the time to look at it and make some necessary revisions that we see.
I think it's in original language.
Correct. So with that, Joe, would you like for me to go ahead and turn it over to you, or?
Sure. And before we go through the list, I wanted to just talk about my point of view from annexation and plan developments under state law, and what already exists out there under state law, and then what municipalities are typically doing within the confines of that state law. So with regards to annexation, state law has some very specific statutes about how annexation occurs. There's a lot of verbiage committed to annexations that are done by a vote of the residents of the annexed territory, 50%, 75% vote. As a practical matter, most of the annexations that occur, however, are with 100% approval of the owners of the property being annexed. And that was, of course, the case this past year with the petition we were addressing. And that annexation process is actually pretty tight. It's one paragraph. And again, we're talking about state law. And that requires that simply that a petition of all the persons owning real estate in the area to be annexed is submitted to the city. And then simply the city agrees on whether to accept the petition or not by ordinance. So of course that requires 2 votes. And that is overwhelmingly the most common way these occur. So that's what state law requires, and the cities are left to decide all the other issues that might arise from an annexation. How to do it beyond this basic framework, and most importantly as well, what to do about the zoning question. Now, if you go out and look at all the cities in South Carolina, you're going to find that maybe half of them have no additional annexation ordinance. They have the state law, and that's what they go by, and they address it as best they can. I would say the half that do have some sort of annexation ordinance, most of those ordinances are addressing the zoning question. how will that property be zoned when we annex it? And I would say that a good number of them allow for the party petitioning to be annexed to include a request for a specific zoning category. Okay, that's very common, and frankly, I think that's just even cities that don't have annexation ordinances. I mean, that's kind of the standard way that it happens, because it has to be zoned in some way or another. And a lot of the cities will have, you know, if there isn't a request, we're going to zone it this way. There might be one or two with a temporary zoning. There's some implication in our annexation ordinance. We do have, as you know, an annexation ordinance that puts us in place a 30-day moratorium following the annexation on any agreements to be entered. And there's an implication that there's maybe some temporary zoning during that period. As a lawyer, as town counsel, as a town attorney, my greatest interest in all of this is to have clarity. And to me, that's really the goal of the law, is that everyone, the town council, the residents of the town, and the people making the applications have some clarity about what's required of them, what steps are going to be taken, and how this is going to play out within the framework of the state law that's already set out. So I am all for clarification of items. There are some towns who have gone to great lengths to clarify the annexation process, perhaps more in a policy format that's not codified in the ordinance books, but very exacting steps about when is staff going to review an annexation application, what factors are they going to consider? Is that annexation petition and zoning request going to go to a planning commission? How long are they going to consider it? And then eventually it gets to town council. And of course, again, since it's got to be passed by ordinance, there's got to be 2 votes, 2 meetings, at least 7 days apart.
Joe,
Yes.
can I ask you a question? Or a comment anyway? It seems to me, in listening to what we're trying to accomplish,
I'm sorry, you need to speak in the mic.
I'm
You're too
sorry.
far away. Thanks.
whether I was a member of council, a member of the planning commission, or a resident, if someone was trying to be annexed, if a property owner was trying to be annexed into a community, I would want to know during deliberations on this what the plan was. What are you asking for? I'd want to know what your zoning is requirement. Because there's probably, if you look at our circumstance, it's going to be in Charleston County because we would only annex something in Charleston County adjacent to us. It already has a zoning. And if you want something different, I want to know that up front. I want us to all consider that, the community, the planning commission, the town council, whoever. Because I can't evaluate your request. I don't want to annex you into the town and then find what you're trying to do I'm uncomfortable with or don't think it's a good idea. I mean, so let's get it up front. And it sounds like that's what most communities do. And then let's evaluate it in concert with whether we're not going to take in if we don't like it, right?
That's right. That's very much true. And I would be hard pressed to find an argument against that.
Right.
I think that, you know, it is in the town's best interest, as it's in the developer's best interest, or the people petitioning to be entered, and the residents. What are you getting, right? As opposed to a process where, well, first we're going to annex you, and then we're going to decide what to do with you. Mm-hmm. And nobody knows how that's going to play out. So I think most towns that tackle this issue by ordinance or policy are going to allow that zoning and annexation move forward together with an understanding that they are tied together and that you're not, you know what you're getting.
Excuse me, let me ask just a little clarification on that point. So in these communities where they do somewhat tie it together, or they have a discussion beforehand about what their intentions, are they still two separate activities though? So if my intention if I want you to annex me and my intention is to ask for, let's say, a commercial zoning on property that otherwise was previously was residential, does that doesn't predispose the annexation to create that commercial zoning? It's still a separate process for the zoning, correct?
You have to,
John, my understanding of the municipalities that have zoning and annexation policies and procedures that are more detailed actually allow the petitioner to put their zoning request up front into a single ordinance, in which case it's passed as a single ordinance. And if the petitioners don't like it, that is to say the zoning gets changed at that time, they have the opportunity to withdraw their annexation petition prior to the second reading.
that is certainly one way to do it. I think it's important to remember that the zoning question is going to go through all of the procedures and review that any zoning question we have goes through, right? Including planning commission and public hearing and all of that. And it is entirely common that procedure is put in to lockstep with the annexation procedure. Now, the annexation procedure under state law is not quite as detailed, but you're going to get all that additional review when you're including the zoning review.
But I guess my confusion on it then is if you're technically not annexed until after the second reading, and assuming you get a positive response
That is
there,
correct.
then in between the first reading where they make the application with a presupposed zoning request and the second reading where the annexation is approved, how does the municipality have the authority to actually do the rezoning in that interim period if they don't really have municipal authority over that piece of property? I don't understand how it goes lockstep if it's really two separate processes.
I don't think there's anything really limiting. I mean, you have to adjust your ordinances to recognize that the planning commission is going to be can review zoning of a parcel that's not yet part of the town zoning map, right? Once you make that, put that in your own municipal ordinance, I don't know
Okay.
that there's any limitation.
Gotcha.
I mean,
Okay.
you can do that.
Okay.
And I think a lot of towns do that.
But it has to be
Now,
reflected in the ordinance.
At the end of the day, you're still voting. I mean, you're probably still going to be voting on the two things when it finally gets to council, right? After all this process,
Right.
you'll have the votes in the same, on the same first reading, second reading for both things.
Right.
And now it'll be up to council. I mean, we can put in an ordinance the mechanics of how that vote goes,
Right.
is going to work. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to have a vote on both of those things, and that vote's going to occur on the
Right.
same day.
Right.
Gotcha.
The first
Okay.
and the second reading for both the zoning and the annexation, if we go that way.
And the key is then
and-
just to have it reflected from a procedural standpoint appropriately in the ordinance.
Well, and either an ordinance or policy or resolution, because the way that, in terms of municipalities, the reason why their planning commission, what they put in a policy or an ordinance to essentially assign and look at the zoning, because the planning commission is simply only making a recommendation. They're not approving. So that's why technically I think municipalities feel like it's okay, as long as it's a policy, for them to consider the zoning. And then, as Joe said, everything then comes back to council, because council ultimately has to approve the zoning and you're approving the annexation. So essentially, the planning commission up front, almost like a pre-application process, they're vetting everything. They're only making a recommendation. So then the recommendation for the zoning and the annexation petition, similar to what we were trying to do
Right.
with the old petition. And then everything comes to council essentially as one package.
Joe and Stephanie, two questions. It's come up a couple of times, policy. Is this, in the municipal world, alternatives that you can have ordinances or policies? And are they legally the same? They have the same application, they have the same approval? I mean, I think I heard you say that, and I'm just curious
Yeah.
about what.
I will say a lot of towns have policies or even addenda that tend to exist in kind of a never land in terms of their enforceability. And because of that, there's some questions, there's maybe a bit of a lack of clarity, which as the attorney I don't like. However, in the context of what we've seen in researching what other towns have done with annexation and how that gets zoned, I don't know that having a policy is a bad idea as opposed to an ordinance, because it can be, then you can really get into a lengthy and detailed and transparent process that's set out in a lengthy document. And then you can adopt that and reference it in your annexation ordinance,
But is that
policy as adopted.
Is that a choice that the municipal body makes, that they say, we want to have detailed policies that are be
Yes.
more descriptive, more prescriptive, in terms of what, okay.
You can do it either way, and I really think that's really more a matter of form
And
than
substance.
anything else.
Okay.
If it's in a policy, one difference is that, you can make it a policy that you adopt by resolution, and so if you need to tweak it, it only takes one reading.
Okay, I think we're still on the first bullet. I still get this notion of the moratorium period, and it's highlighted, initial zoning in the moratorium period. And you mentioned 30 days. I thought in the fall, when we went through this with the Andel project, we combined the two.
Yes.
you- What is being proposed as different versus what we did? And if you could just expand on that.
Well, I think there's a question as to whether that 30-day moratorium applied to a planned development and what we were doing.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
It specifically mentions, I believe, help me, it's, what's the wording for it? I gotta go back.
And do you have that, John?
It is blah, blah, this.
I don't have the entire zoning ordinance with me.
But while you're looking
So
at
let's-
but we were consistent
I mean-
with our ordinance.
I think so, and you guys had my opinion on that.
Yes, yes,
And I don't want to go too deeply into
Yes,
it.
I understand.
We felt we were consistent with that ordinance just because, where is it? It says, no development application shall be filed for 30 days. So, I mean, I don't want to get too deeply into it, but there comes a question of what a development application is. And, this is an area where I would wholeheartedly agree that some clarity is necessary.
So this
There
language,
is nothing wrong with a 30-day moratorium or
Oh.
lengthening the period. There is what, from my point of view, is important is that there's some clarity of how that's going to work and what it applies to.
Okay, so this language, initial zoning for annexation, the moratorium period for process, provides that clarity.
Pardon?
This language under the suggested change, initial zoning for annexation territory and moratorium period for processing the initial zoning, provides for that level of clarity.
It is more clear, certainly, but again, the question is, it probably could be better.
So
I'm
let
gonna
me
put it that way.
So
I'll put it that way. I mean,
Better in the sense that there's nothing wrong with this, better in the sense to provide more clarity.
correct.
Okay.
so
And exactly what you're talking. And frankly, I think what we should move forward to, if this is where we want to go, is setting out just a larger process that subsumes that moratorium. And the idea of the moratorium is to give time to consider
Okay. And I think that's
whatever
what we're all-
application you're looking at, which is a worthy goal.
That's a word. I agree. Okay.
It's just putting it more clearly in where does it go in our process.
Okay.
So but at the end of the day, the two things, the annexation process and potentially rezoning process, are still two different tasks that are just done in concert.
Correct.
So if I
Absolutely.
maybe I'm going to oversimplify it, maybe I'm going to complicate, I'm not sure. But if I have somebody that applies for annexation with a desired zoning outcome, then to Dan's point, that allows us to evaluate whether we even want to entertain bringing that property into the town.
That's right.
So let's just suppose that we say, yep, that's pretty consistent with what we see. So we vote on the first reading of the annexation, yes. Really, that annexation process somewhat takes a pause while we address now the zoning aspects of it, which could take a week, a month, 2 months. It could take some period of time, at which time the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to the council that you either adopt or reject the applicant's
Exactly.
desired zoning. If at that point the Planning Commission recommends that we reject it, we don't really reject it until that time that we vote on it at the second reading. So if we then vote on that component and we reject it, as the Planning Commission has suggested, before we vote on the second reading of the annexation, the applicant can pull his application, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
So if we
in
vote,
If that's what you guys.
I know, but I'm just, let me
allow
just
that.
walk
That's
through
what the
this.
applicant wants,
If
yeah.
we, in spite of the rejection recommendation, we approve the zoning request, which obviously we could do if that's what we thought was best, then he could leave his application in and potentially get a positive second reading on the annexation, and then it's done.
Yeah.
So again, one question is the separation of the two efforts and what happens in that rezoning process, and the second is then the timing of the voting on that second reading of the annexation piece.
Right.
So it seems to me that if we get the rezoning process defined like we want it, and it may already be that way in our ordinances, then we really don't have a huge issue as long as we stick to that process.
No, I don't think we have a huge issue. I mean, we do need to clarify that those two things
Right.
can move together.
Coincidentally, but as two processes.
And I would add even furthermore, when you put a pause on that annexation process for the Planning Commission to review the zoning request, you can put procedures in place to clarify that they can also review the annexation, and make a recommendation on that as well.
The Planning Commission.
Correct. So, I mean, they're not going to be just limited. I mean, they're not just looking at zoning
In a vacuum,
void,
right.
right? It's zoning in the context of we're going to annex and we're going to zone. What are the recommendations of that?
Right.
So it kind of expands their purview.
Okay.
Does that get into the second, we'll consider the first reading of an ordinance to approve an application for one, not less than 30 days following the receipt,
Yeah.
and two, not less, so
Yeah.
now we're getting into that before consideration for a first reading, these procedural steps are taken?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it certainly incorporates the idea that's expressed here and in our existing ordinance that,
But is the catalyst is the catalyst behind this council, or is it the planning commission on annexation? That's B. I mean, who,
I don't understand.
the town council will consider, this, the description, but has the ball been bounced from the council to the planning commission, who holds sessions with the community relative to the annexation itself, or is it the council that's doing this before it even gets moved over to the planning commission?
Well, we can shape it however we want,
Okay.
right? Just so long as state law requires, town council have 2 readings, at least 7 days apart, and when it's zoning, it also goes through planning commission.
Well, I'm talking about even prior to first reading. I'm talking about.
Sure.
Okay.
So,
And I
but if you-
think,
but
I
if you
mean, we can take a look at that as to whether, and that's actually, I was going to push back a little bit, that, we don't necessarily even need to tee it up with that first reading. There can be review even prior
To the first,
Right.
to it coming to council,
for first reading.
right?
So there's no real rush to this, presumably.
Yes,
And that's
exactly.
the key, I think, is that, if you get an application, unless the person that's applying has some compelling reason, it seems reasonable that you can have a period, 30 days, where you take public input, you go and walk around the property, you see what's going on, and then
Have a
30
staff
days,
review.
whatever it
Staff
is, and then 30 days later, you have your first reading.
Well, essentially what you've said is take the middle portion of what you said before, and instead of having the application, the petition come for first reading for annexation, then do all of the planning commission stuff, community meetings, public input. Since you take the guts of that and put it before the annexation application.
Right.
So essentially, if an applicant petitioner come before staff and say we want to submit an annexation petition, and this is the zoning, then what we would do is essentially can say, okay, there's a pre-application process, a community meeting process. These are the things you need to go through first before you officially submit, before we officially accept your annexation petition. And all those things will lead up to ultimately, if planning commission supports this through the community meetings, et cetera, then there's a recommendation. So then when the annexation petition comes for first reading, you have the recommendation already from.
Well, I
From
don't,
planning
I
commission
think
with
that, I
zoning.
think, I hear what you're saying. I think that adds some confusion back to it. I think if the more we can keep the 2 processes initially separated, I've got a guy that's making an application for annexation. And right now, he may have presupposed what he wants the zoning to be, but I don't think that we need to have all the planning commission involvement on that yet.
It's not.
Let's give everybody a chance to review that annexation application, and maybe it's 30 days or not less than 30 days, and then we have the first reading of the annexation petition. Because then you're going to pass it off to the planning commission to do their work.
I almost want to say, I mean, there is
Yeah.
nothing to prevent us, and some towns do it this way, but there's nothing to prevent us from saying, this is going to require 3 readings by town council. You can have an initial approval. You can involve town council at different stages. And indeed, some towns have a 3 reading requirement for an ordinance, which is why I was thinking of it. But if you wanted, you could have town council need to have some sort of initial approval to get the whole ball rolling.
Yeah, it just seems to me that the first reading is very innocuous, because everything happens
Right.
after that first reading.
Right.
The first reading doesn't cost anybody anything.
Right.
Well, that was my,
Scott has,
I think
have a
Mary
question.
Ann's been trying to get
Oh,
a
I'm
question
sorry.
in.
Hold on, Scott, Vicky.
Hold on.
For the first reading, we don't vote to approve anything.
Correct.
And I think it's important to remember that. All we're doing is authorizing that to move forward for further discussion and review.
I can't emphasize enough that that is
That
correct.
is really
Correct.
important to
I mean,
remember.
first reading almost.
It's just
I
title
mean,
only for the most part.
Right. Thank you.
But there's a weight behind first reading. I opt for having open sessions or whatever we want to call them before the thing called a first reading. The first reading just has a feel about it, a
Yeah, you don't
connotation.
jump into it, you still
No,
look
no,
at it.
no, I understand that, but if we find ourselves having a first reading and then, but it's really not what it says. I mean, it is what it says. It's the first reading. So anyway,
Mayor,
I
Scott,
think we should do things.
Scott would like to get a comment
Yeah.
in. Go ahead, Scott.
You know, I think we're all saying essentially the same thing in terms of the process, but if you go back and look at the way the town of Bluffton does it, I mean, in chapter 5, they just lay out a process that is so straightforward.
Yeah.
And, I mean, there are 4 steps that take place with staff and the applicant before then the town has its first, not reading, but they announce that there is an intent for annexation. And a lot of work has already been done, and at that time, there are talking points that come from the planning commission and from the staff, and then it goes on for another several more steps, and the first reading occurs at step 11 in the process. And you know,
Yeah.
the more I have reviewed this would take, if we adopted something along these lines, it would provide complete clarity, it would take all the lack of transparency issues off the table, and I think that this is kind of the way we need to be looking at it. And Joe is, you know, when he talks about 3 readings, I think what he's really talking about is the first one is not a formal reading. Instead, it's an intent for an announcement that there is an intent for annexation.
Just for the listening audience, as part of the research and preparation for today, Joe and Stephanie have been looking at approaches, other communities, other municipalities, and they came across the town of Bluffton's approach. And so for those of you that may have just caught that, that's what the reference is to be. And if you want to look it up, you're
And
certainly.
it's not their ordinance. They have a
Policy.
policy manual that is 20 or 30 pages. It's quite lengthy.
But it was some of that has just the state.
The different.
A lot of it's
100%.
duplicative because there are so many different ways to annex under state law. The 75%, the 50% method, and
25% not there.
and you know, it becomes duplicative. They just repeat the process regardless of how the annexation occurs, and you may need to parse that apart. It just creates more verbiage.
Joe, Stephanie, the items,
In our situation, it's pretty much always going to be 100%.
It will be.
I can only think of one possible exception to that rule, or that statement. And you know, to the best of my knowledge, they tried that once and they didn't. It was rejected. So.
this pre-zoning conditional zoning not permitted, no application for annexation, you know. Are we covering this in the context of our discussion? Shall be approved if the application made subject to express condition.
And I think it's important to point out here that, I mean, we've already talked somewhat about the conditions. Can it be conditional or should it not be conditional?
Okay.
I do want to make clear, I mean, ultimately, that's council's decision to make. There's no requirement under state law or any other general law that says you have to do it one way or the other. My feeling, and I think staff shares it, and it's already been expressed here, is that having a conditional zoning might be beneficial. It's hard to imagine who benefits from having the zoning and then rolling the dice on what having the annexation, and then what are we going to do about zoning?
Yeah, I think the language in C is confusing.
Well,
I do too.
I'm not, yeah.
I think we can clarify it, because I read the first part and it says, you know, no application without a, I want you to tell me what you want. I'm not going to prove anything. I just want you to tell me what you want.
I think staff and I agree with that.
And the second sentence says, okay, you can make it with a stated preference. That's what I want to hear, because that's what we're going to look at. It was funny, when Freshfields came in for history knowledge, as simple as it seems, one owner, it was already a planned development. The Planning Commission spent weeks figuring out what changes needed to be made to that planned development to make it acceptable for annexation. There were a whole bunch of uses that were eliminated when the town brought it in. When it was in the county, it was far less restrictive than what it is today. So enormous work went on with the Planning Commission for weeks to figure that all out. That, to your point, John, is a very important step in this process. The annexation kind of opens the door, but Planning Commission has enormous work to do. Whether or not it seems simple or not, it's complicated. And we've got good people on the Planning Commission, and then they come back with us to the council with a recommendation. Here's what we think.
And those are the guys who roll up their sleeves and get down in the dirt and really dig into what becomes really detailed, especially when you're talking about planned development. I mean, there are a lot of moving pieces, and that's what planning commissions are there to tackle.
Go-kart races were permitted under the county rules. We decided not to have go-kart races.
Okay.
And
So we've talked about process clearly. We've talked about application of ordinances and policies, but I guess the overarching issue is one of clarity and community input and time.
That's right.
It seems, I guess, just to not to summarize, but I guess just to keep zeroing in on. I've never been to Bluffton. I don't even know where it's at, but we're not out looking for annexation. This community is not out there looking at other properties. We have probably one, over the next, goodness knows, however many years, that's really going to be in question. I don't know. Well, there may be other. I can't think of any. So that's what's going to be the point of discussion about this over the next years and years and years to come. What other councils may be confronted with in terms of applications for annexation. So that, okay. All right. Are we through C?
I think so.
Yeah, I believe we are.
We've kind of jumped ahead and dealt with, what I view are we've almost hit on everything. I think we're all of the same mind that, an expanded review process that comes at the front end, that involves planning commission, which also involves public input, is beneficial for all concerned. And that the other big issue is the zoning question, and that can be front-ended as well.
Right.
Well, I leave it up to further discussion, but it just seems to me that, and I have read what they did at Bluffton, it just seems to me that procedurally, explicitly linking out those steps would make it so much better than looking at an ordinance and trying to interpret or reinterpret words. That just really spells all of this out over the, as you said, Scott, 11 steps or whatever number of steps. So, okay.
It's 11 or steps. Yes. And that kind of subsumes, in my mind, C, D,
E.
Yeah, I comment on D. I think
B.
D makes little sense. I don't want to force an annexation to be zoned to R1 at the time of annexation when that was never the intent. To me, it confuses and complicates a process. Something to consider.
Well, I think if you said that the annexation process and the rezoning process or zoning process are sequential, then you could argue this might be appropriate, but they're not.
If they're
sequential.
running in
They're
parallel,
coincidental as separate processes.
Right.
Then you don't need to have a temporary.
exactly. It
Right.
creates a step you don't need to do.
Right.
If anything, if I were a developer or a member of the community, I wouldn't like this process. So,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
we're good.
Okay, E, did, this pause moratorium shall be filed through.
Oh, B, yes.
E,
E,
E is in Edward.
Oh, okay, I see, yeah. Well, and again, to me, the pause on this is to allow, and it says, to allow the town council and town planning commission to initiate amendments to the zoning district map to count for initial zoning. Well, I mean, I think we're moving towards doing that, right? Except it ain't gonna be initial zoning, it's gonna be permanent zoning.
Yeah,
And again, this
and
kind of assumes it's a sequential process.
Yes.
yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
not.
Or
it doesn't have to
can-
be.
It doesn't have to be, right.
Right.
okay.
Right there. These two, just again for everybody's, maybe everybody knows this. These two clarification, these two sections, 12-79, 12-159, are housed in
Our zoning ordinance.
a zoning ordinance. Fundamentally, as part of your review and ultimate recommendations, should they be separated? And if so, is there value to separate them, just from
No,
a...
they are two different issues. So yes,
No, I
they-
know that.
yeah.
No, I know that, but
You're talking about two separate ordinances?
well, I'm not sure what I'm talking. I mean, I don't know if it's two different ordinances
Well-
or two different policies or something that makes it, for the reader, for a new community member that just steps into Kioma and says, I'm interested in reading this, reading what you have. I'm a developer for whatever they're just interested. Would that make it easier or more complicated?
Well, I think one of the things that, what we're looking at is making probably the recommendation and working with members of the community is looking at really a holistic approach so that if someone's coming to want to annex, this is the process to annex. 12-159 is really only dealing with one zoning classification. If you want to come in as a commercial or residential, we will have a process for you to follow, which essentially will be under maybe however we phrase it, it may be a policy, but really it's almost a 12-79. The 12-159 really lays out the guidelines if you want to come in as a PD. Is that?
Okay,
So it will still be in the zoning ordinance because this 12-159 is a zoning classification within our zoning ordinance. Of course, the other is in the zoning ordinance, but I think if you create a policy that would address
Okay.
whatever zoning classification you,
Right.
So
You-
so
and
as
you
a
have to
matter of
make
practice, municipalities have these as we have them.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll just have to make sure that the annexation process, whatever we adopt for that process, will allow sufficient time to address a plan development
Right.
application, which in some ways is probably, the most complicated zoning classification we have, because it's, and I've made this point, is we've got to keep in mind that process would have, doing what we have to do, would have to fit inside that annexation consideration. And it might be, if it's a planned development as opposed to a standard commercial district, for instance, it's going to lengthen
it has a much lengthier process
Oh, yeah.
that time-wise.
Okay.
There's going to be a lot more time involved
for the planning commission.
for the planning commission, because they have a lot more things to consider, right? Because I didn't even get around to it, but the plan development process, is another state law creation where the state law says you can go out and have plan development zoning, but then there's not a lot of meat to the bone or details about the process that cities can follow to adopt the plan development. And so this is a case where, because it's so brief, and I mean, there's like 1 or 2 sentences about what a planned development means under state law.
Right.
So almost every municipality has a lengthy planned development ordinance that has all the procedures that you got to go through, all the reviews, all the factors that are going to be considered. And I mean, some larger towns even have different categories of planned developments. And so our planned development ordinance is not unusual in that aspect. I mean, it's structured very much the same way as everyone else's is. And so it really comes down to each municipality deciding, well, these are the factors we want to be included in that process, and these are the procedural steps for review in that process.
Okay.
And adding adding factors for consideration is entirely within the town's purview. And I think that's kind of what one of the goals here is. I mean, you know, how planned development will impact a community. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of everything here, right?
Right.
You know, that is obviously a factor. That's the factor. and you know, we're just parsing apart, or traffic, or utilities, or
Environmental.
environmental impact. All that stuff is, I mean, you know, is necessarily part of that review. And certainly it can be, if there's a feeling that it isn't sufficiently set out in what we currently have, I encourage the addition of additional factors. I mean,
Okay.
And I think the state, the only thing really that they are pretty strict about with regards to the PD is that it has to be mixed use. You can't have a single use PD. So
that's about the only.
that's about the only thing that they restrict with regards to PD that municipalities have to follow.
Okay, with that, do we want to move to,
Could you say that again?
He may hear you closer.
Yeah, so the state law, the one requirement is that PDs be mixed use.
Okay.
Generally speaking, that is what they were. Now there's office parks maybe, and a few other things that really aren't relevant to Kiowa, but it's got to be mixed use, right? And then how you implement that is largely left up to the municipality. I mean, of course, it's got to go through the standard zoning, which means planning commission, but it's largely left up to municipalities. And frankly, municipalities tend to follow the same map,
Yeah.
right? Their ordinances read and are structured similarly.
Define, if you would, for my benefit, mixed use.
Residential, commercial.
Residential and commercial.
That's it. Those
Yes.
are the two categories.
Well, no, that's not two categories, but just give you an example.
No, I know, okay,
Yeah.
but
You can have institution in there with residential and a little bit of commercial, similar to like what down the street at the medical center they were looking at. They were gonna have, you know,
Commercial,
institution, residential, and commercial all
Right.
in there.
and that would be a planned development.
That'd be considered planned development.
So in terms of looking at what took place, it was a planned development because it was commercial and residential.
Correct.
Then when they pulled back the residential and went for commercial, it would have been just zoned as commercial?
Correct.
And that would have changed the process altogether?
Well, not necessarily. The process would have been the same, with the exception that the planning commission wouldn't have had such a lengthy review because you wouldn't have the planned development piece of it. It still would have to go through it still would have had to go through the planning commission.
What Dan was saying, in terms of the process that we took place initially with Freshfields in terms of uses and standard, things like that.
right, and that's because it was a plan.
Yeah, it was already planned development in the county. We just looked at the uses and removed some of the uses.
Okay?
But it's considered planned development because you can't have residential in Freshfields.
Right. Okay. All right. Are we ready
So
to move to
To plan development?
Well,
Or
12-159 or any?
Plan development,
Yes.
that's plan development.
Yeah, is there any other
Correct.
comments, do you think? Stephanie, Joe, I mean,
So,
it's
We wanna
clear
start-
for me. For me.
We'll start on page 7, was the first
yeah.
comment, which was I think a fairly one that we all agreed, yes, community involvement should, yes, that page right there.
Anything but be that as it may, I don't take the opportunity that while we're here, we're doing it, and we, but from A through D, is there any changes, any improvements that could be, should be made relative to that, or?
There was none that they had suggested, and staff at this time has not looked
Okay.
into.
Okay.
Anything else?
Just one point, and this may be minor, but the one that says, letters of support from the community in such numbers as shall be evidence of general community support for the proposed PD development plan.
Oh, wait a minute, you just jumped to the next one, okay.
Yeah.
I thought you
Skip to the
said,
next area.
That's
We
under
haven't
D.
got, D,
We're
yeah,
gonna get to that.
D1, we were just looking at D1.
Oh, okay.
He's
All right.
at D2 now.
Oh, okay.
D1,
Sorry.
we all support that.
All right,
Right.
Okay.
Or are we,
Now number 2.
We're done with D1,
Okay.
we're on D2.
well, just to clarify, yeah, D1, I mean, community involvement is what we're here
Fine.
about. D2, so, and probably the biggest, one of the larger changes to the PD ordinance that's been suggested says after the required pre-application conference and the conducting of community outreach workshops is the first thing. And I don't know that part is problematic
Right.
for me or staff. Again, we're,
Right.
getting community input is always a good thing,
Right.
right? But later, and this is the subsection I, it requires letters of support from community in such numbers as shall evidence general community support for the proposed PD development plan. And, now that is, from my point of view, maybe a little problematic. I become concerned about adding substantive steps beyond what is required under regular law, and there's also some practicality.
Yeah, I don't know how I would define
Support.
well, why would you have
General
a statement in
community
there's only
support.
one-sided?
I could understand why I'd want to have input letters, pro and con. I don't like this, I like this. I'd like to see that and determine, but I can't. First of all, I don't just want letters of support, I want letters objecting to it. I'll look at those. But then to evidence general community support, boy, that's a fuzzy line. I don't know how to define it.
It is, yes, and I think
It's kind of one,
staff
I
would
know
agree
it when
with
I
that.
see it, but I can't define it ahead of time or something.
Well, the miniature golf application next door, as I recall, we sent out the request from the community, and we had the survey, and then there were large numbers of letters opposing it. They in turn had letters supporting it. Was that a criteria of the county, that they had to have letters both of support?
I don't think so.
Of the
And John,
opposition, or
speak
how
on-
did-
On that.
Or was that just up to the developer?
You may have to go to
one of
the,
the
take your thing off and go to the mic, because it's hard to hear.
One of the things that with the golf course next door, one of the things that transpired with that was the letters of support. Trust County Planning Commission asked them to reach out to the town of Keywater directly, just because the adjacency. The letters of support and the community response from residents on the island was overwhelmingly sort of negative. And so they took it on themselves as the applicants to go and sort of balance that, if you will, by going to recruit additional letters of support.
John, turn the mic on there. Oh, you can't because of, yeah.
So one of those things that, as for the Fresh Fields and Del Track, that was sort of we did as part of that process, that is essentially what is the request here is adding that additional opportunity for public input through a community workshop, and so that was actually took a step before any formal happenings, and so that's really, I think, from a staff's perspective, that would be my recommendation, or at least my perspective of you allow the community to have that input before it is even sort of at first reading, as Mayor mentioned earlier. Hopefully that answers the question.
But I guess my point is that, you know, if you're gonna, if what you want, this is really kind of a somewhat non-objective requirement. What you want is community input in the form of letters, emails, whatever, in support or in opposition to this process. You don't, and this one suggests that there is some threshold that says, okay, now we have community approval because it says insufficient numbers. Well, what is that? Is that 10%, 20%, 80%? So I just think you want to solicit pros and con input in any way you can get it.
Exactly.
And the venue for that typically would come through the public hearing process where you would get that up.
Or if I don't go to a public hearing, then write a letter or send an email, but collect it.
One other note that I'll add is that as part of section plan development also requires what we call general support would be from service providers and those other things as part of that letter. So those kind of would also kind of represent some of that general support as well.
Yep.
So, yeah. I mean, I think the intent is something that's good and beneficial and part of the process as it exists. Putting a requirement on an applicant to come up with some undefined level of community support in writing is maybe not the best way to go about that, but
The intent is
certainly
desirable. We want,
You want the
councils will want
certainly.
indication from the community and how they feel. How to quantify that in terms, you know, I would rather it would be in terms of time and meetings and feedback and the like. Well, we'll put a gray one on it.
How the community felt in the two public workshops and comment periods we had as part of the county council and the planning commission. So I don't know that the additional letters of support or in such numbers is going to somehow, you know, change how we feel or how we perceive the community supporting or not supporting such a project.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, well, hold on. The next one is item E.
D2E. And, I mean, this was just some additional factors were added: utility service, fire, ambulance, and certainly, you know, those should all be factors to be considered. We can add them. This is frankly just a list of examples in any case, but staff and I, we're fine with adding factors to consider.
And I would like, and I'll point out, as John just said, as part of the PD requirement, we're required to get letters from these various entities to let us know if they can support it. So while we only listed as an example, we're required, and we do go out and get, and they get a copy of the plan and they'll comment on it, and then we'll take that into consideration when reviewing it.
Okay.
Can I ask, do you have the environmental committee review proposed plans?
That's something that, as we're looking at making suggested changes, John, on the PD, do we have something where the environmental aspect is reviewed?
It's not explicitly there. It does give leeway to staff to authorize any additional information. So if there are questions regarding environmental, I typically will already reach out to Jim as far as just just getting this input, but there's nothing.
Or the
specific-
Conservancy.
Or,
we were just-
or the Conservancy or something of that nature.
I would suggest that when you get an application, it should be reviewed by the environmental committee also, not just areas that you think might be environmental.
Yeah, we can definitely look, as we're putting this together, like the mayor said, this is gonna be a process. So as we're making changes, we'll have an opportunity to review, and others in the community will have an opportunity to review. So yes, we can add some language in there with regards to the environmental impact, and require, normally some ordinances say as applicable, then you require environmental impact. So yeah, we'll definitely
There
add
will
that
be
in. The
cases
Conservancy
when-
reached out to us, and so we're going to add something in there.
Yes.
There will be cases where you have flood zone areas and marshes that would be impacted.
For sure,
And certainly, they would have an opinion on that.
for sure.
Absolutely.
F,
You know, I have kind of the same comment on this one that I did on the one about the just positive letters. I mean, you know, demonstrating the proposed development will not create traffic congestion in the town. To what extent, for what period of time? You know, during the construction, it may be terrible, but then after it's finished, it may be none. I just think that what you really want is you want a thorough traffic study done, period.
Yeah, you want
I don't want you to think to presuppose some condition on that traffic study.
Well, and it also says not create traffic congestion. We have traffic congestion.
Congestion now.
So,
Read in the most literal light, that would seem to be problematic,
Yeah.
that there's no congestion. I mean, we do require a traffic study.
do we, let's clarify units. 50 units, 50 what? Housing units? Is that what we mean?
Dwelling units.
Dwelling units?
And that's in our current,
That's the current.
that's the current language, so we
Okay.
need to
Let's
clarify that.
clarify.
but the clarification is that we require a traffic study.
Right.
As-
We do require a traffic study.
We do
yeah.
require traffic.
If it meets those
50
two
dwelling
criteria.
units.
So if it's 5 acres or more, or if contains 50 or more units, then they're required to do a traffic study.
And presumably that traffic study would include issues of potential
Congestion.
congestion.
Very similar to the Andelin annexation,
Safety.
they were required to do a traffic study, and they did do one, and they
Right.
presented it to us, and then we gave it to our consultant traffic engineer to review it.
Okay.
And then we had commented, but of course it stopped, but they did do a traffic study because it was a requirement based on our current ordinance.
Okay. N,
Right?
So, yeah, N addresses the potential conflicts of interest that might exist for council or planning commission or staff. We do kind of review this as problematic in terms of, I mean, first of all, I would just say that state law already contains extensive has a whole ethics code that everyone here is bound by, and requires disclosures of any conflict of interest and recusal. And these things occur on a regular basis. Not so much here, but in towns across the state, council members recuse themselves regularly from zoning decisions because that's what's required by state law. A disclosure form, there's a specific form required by state law that you would have to fill out, submit on the record, public record, and recuse yourself. The town does not have the power to alter those state ethical rules. They can't exempt themselves from those state ethical rules. And by the same token, though, I don't think they can change them.
but I think this is engaged by the applicant. So I think the focal point is, and not, this is a long paragraph with, just some, is it do municipalities have some type of attestation that the applicant would complete saying, maybe disclosing who they have engaged, who's working for them?
Can I give you an example that concerns me about this? If I hire somebody to do a traffic study, it may be the same company that's been hired by Kika to do a traffic study. And I don't think that's a conflict.
No, I'm not saying it's a conflict. I'm just saying it's a disclosure. I mean, a conflict of interest is typically what isn't disclosed. I mean, so if there's an attestation that the applicant would sign describing who they've engaged, then they've disclosed it.
So if I'm an applicant and I've hired the same engineering firm to look at traffic studies, do I need to list them because the town of Kiowa, for example, has used them before?
Possibly.
Yeah.
This is not disqualifying you from doing the work,
Yeah,
it's just
no,
saying
no.
you need to,
No, I'm just-
you need
I
to
want
say it.
clarification.
You need to let people know that
That's
you've
all
done
I'm
it.
saying, Dan. Just,
Well, it sounds like if we're wanting to add something like this, this is where I can go back to the group for clarification, because obviously we're not quite sure.
yeah.
And maybe because it's so lengthy that maybe it can be clarified and tightened up, and then we can see if this is something that we could add into a municipal ordinance.
I mean,
Yeah,
it
we're not
almost
saying,
sounds
we're
like-
not saying who's approved as the attorney, we're not saying who's approved as the architect, or who's approved as the engineer, or who's approved as the whatever, but just an attestation of who they are.
But I think it's confusing the way it's written, and I think that it implies almost that you're taking the professional who's gonna work for you and evaluating his contacts and uses. Why does that matter to what we do?
Well, I can see that they need to disclose potential conflicts and
Right.
potential conflicts has this kind of a negative connotation. What you really want them to do is disclose their call it whatever you want,
Have you
past
worked
history or what,
previously
but it's
with
just potential conflicts. I mean, that's
facilities?
really all they're doing. We're not saying it's a bad thing. We want to know who else you've done work for that might be an entity involved in this.
Okay.
And like
Right.
your traffic study of Kika and town is a great example.
Right.
Right.
Because a lot of times for us as an island and community, we sometimes use the same consultants
They're more
because of the
Right.
historical knowledge.
Yeah, I can think of one that we see all the time.
Well, yeah, I
You know,
mean, you have the two main developers on the island that may use the same consultant, and so sometimes which hat that person's wearing, that may be what maybe this is what this section is leading up to, is that,
We need
One-
to rewrite this.
Yeah.
but I can work with the group and.
But I just look at this, because of the intimate nature of our size and who we are, everybody knows everybody. So
Yeah.
they know, that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there's another council and new people and whatever. And the property is sold, so even the framework that we've talked about that in terms of
Right.
what the whole things could change
Oh,
10 years from now.
absolutely.
So I mean, I don't know that having just something that requires whoever would own that there would have to be some disclosure. I don't know. Okay. Well,
Yes, Scott?
Oh, yes, sir.
I'm a little confused here, because I can certainly see that a potential conflict of interest between a governmental agent, such as ourselves, or the planning commission, needs to be disclosed, and it is disclosed, and it's taken care of by state law and state ethics committee. But who cares, quite honestly, who the resort hires to pay
Right.
the parking lot? I don't see that as a potential conflict of interest anymore.
That was my,
That's just a business contract between two parties.
right.
So why do they need to disclose?
That was my
We're
feeling.
gonna hire ABC paving company to lay asphalt. Am I missing something? Is that a conflict of interest that should concern the town?
No, I don't think so. I think that's why we have to go back and just kind of
We gotta rewrite.
we have to
Right.
reword this and understand what may be the intent. And so it may be that we can work with the group and they can help us clean that language up.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
oops, sorry, this is just for,
So next when we move to, so you'll do that, Stephanie?
Yes.
We got time to do all that. So next is
It's really page 14.
page 14.
Go on to the next.
Well,
I
page
think you're-
13,
It's
bottom
14,
of page 13.
no, yep, that's it.
You have page, we don't have pages 14.
Yeah, it's this
Yeah.
last page here.
That's the next,
D, E, F, G, and H.
correct.
Again, this is approval criteria,
Mm-hmm.
which we talked about. I mean, the town, I mean, we're free to put in whatever criteria we feel that the town feels is appropriate to consider for a planned development. I think it's important that that criteria is worded well with clarity. And there may be some, some of this wording probably needs to be cleaned up. I think they're good ideas. We just need to make sure that the standards aren't so vague as to make it difficult for people to comply with.
Let me go to D. I don't know how you would ask
Yeah.
a development to protect the health, safety, morals, and the welfare of the
And the
public.
morals especially.
That's a burden you're placing on somebody that's impossible.
I think it's
I want you to protect,
wordsmithing
All right.
is maybe what's going on there. I don't think that's the intent. I think the development will not will not harm.
well, yeah, we just need to
Right.
reword that significantly.
I think all four of these, or all five of these are just superfluous, quite honestly. You know, we're already gonna make sure that there's not an adverse impact to the natural environment, that's part of the process. Potential conflicts of interest have already been taken care of. Adverse impacts to the town, Charleston regional infrastructure, that's all part of the process. The development has the general support of the town residents, we've already addressed that in terms of the public meeting hearings. So I just don't see that these are necessary, D through H.
Well, and we could make sure though that they are part of the process more broadly. Right?
Right, I think,
Still out in the TD process, but
yeah, and that's one of the things, when we're looking at, and why I really like what Bluffton's done, because a lot of the things that this group have asked us to consider,
Or in there.
I think will be part of that process. So I think ultimately the goal is to, from the community, and what we want to do is make sure that we have community involvement, we have an opportunity and time to review the process, allow the planning commission to do kind of the grunt work up front. And so I think if we're able to somewhat follow that model, a lot of municipalities plagiarize each other, and you tweak it to fit your organization. But ultimately, I think that we'll be able to effectively address a lot of their 15 concerns. It may not be their exact wording, it may not be in the exact format or where they placed it, but hopefully, in the end, they will feel like we listened and we were able to make positive change. I think that would benefit current council, future council, and same for community and for the applicants.
However, this falls under the rubric approved criteria. So I looked at this as an effort of saying, you, Mr. and Mrs. Elected Official, may be approving annexation or zoning. This is the type of criteria that you should be looking at. And I think it warrants thought. I mean, what criteria should we, we've talked about process, we've talked about intent, we've talked about all of those, but when it all boils down to, it's judgment relative to the whole myriad of things that, this exhaustive study that we'll be going through. But nonetheless, it's still judgment on the part of the community's elected officials to approve annexation, to approve the zoning. So, I mean, I think we need to think about it.
Oh, yeah.
Do municipalities have that? I mean, is that a common practice that that they set out criteria that an elected official should use?
Or a planning commission, because remember, this is under the planning
Typically,
commission.
I'm
it's
sorry.
gonna be- and that is, I mean, this does say, I mean, typically it's planning commission, right? And all the criteria that they consider. And town council can consider as well. I would point out, though, that this proposal, I mean, it's in a section that has criteria for town council to consider. But it is just as important, if not more so, that the planning commission have those
I agree,
criteria.
I agree.
But if you have them in here, however simple we may end up wording them, then when the town council is asked to accept or reject the planning commission's recommendations, this gives us somewhat of a checklist to say,
Right,
did you consider this? Did you consider that? I'm
Right.
okay with it being in there as long as
Or
it's
say something.
pretty simple.
You're going up there to speak.
What bothers me though is the approval criteria. It still says applications for PD development plan approval may be approved only if the town council determines that the following criteria are met.
I was just gonna,
Every one of them has to be checked off. There's no cutting, there's no check and balance.
Well,
Well,
that's,
maybe instead of met, it's considered. I don't know, but
as it is, that's in the existing,
wait.
that's
Yeah.
existing language.
that's the existing language. I was just saying, the planning
Yeah.
commission utilizes this same criteria for their recommendation. So it would be the same language that you'll be vetting as town council.
Yep.
Okay.
It really is a process of engage the community, slow it down so we all understand what's
You're
going
not
on.
speaking to Mike.
Know as much as we can up front so we can all take time to consider it. Follow all the steps and come up with a conclusion. We can do that. This is good.
Sure.
And hopefully, I mean, we've had three applications, but we've had 2 annexations. My guess is over the next decade, we may get 1 or 2 more. Who knows? But I don't think it's going to be very many. I think the town is reasonably well-defined right now. And I, for one, as a member of town council, like our community. I don't want to see it dramatically change in any form. I think we just need to work on it.
Well, I think the eye-opener for, maybe not so much for those of us that have lived here and understand the development process over these last 40 years, but maybe for newer residents, that there's 500 acres between Freshfields and the gate owned by a single entity, and I bet you a lot of people drove back to wherever they lived and thought, what in the world? I didn't know that. I thought that was a big parking lot. So I think that that was the, amongst other things. Okay. Well, look at us. 12:25.
Ask any
So you
final remarks?
you have, yeah, any further comments? Scott?
No, I'm good.
John?
No.
Mary Ann?
No.
Dan, anything else? Dan, anything
No,
else?
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, so this was day 1. Day 2 and 3 is Thursday and Friday. Day 2, John has some comments relative to planning, I guess in its broadest sense. We're not going to be getting into this, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So we will reconvene in a workshop format on February the 8th. So I think that it's been a productive session. You have input, thoughts, reactions, whatever. I am somewhat intrigued by this notion of policies and procedures vis-a-vis ordinances, and I applaud Joe. I mean, clarity is clearly the subject of the day. So whatever, if we can plagiarize somebody else's stuff, whatever, if it makes sense.
Mr. Mayor, would you, by the February 8th meeting, are you expecting this council for staff to come up with a first draft for consideration, like talk to the group and then we come and actually put together a draft, or what would you like for us to have
I
prepared?
think, Steph, I think that's the key. Talking, there were representatives that presented the petition. I don't think you're going to be able to get back to the petitioners en masse. I don't know. But clearly there were authors of this that had ideas and perspectives and implications. So I think between now and February 8th, that would be very helpful.
Okay.
If we were on track, off track, whatever we were doing this past hour and a half, that would be helpful for February 8th. So and then the extent to which you can just, add to that in terms of that we were on track, let's just say, and, start looking at language. And again, I encourage the community, start writing comments and suggestions and reactions. If you're listening, you're here and attending today, and we can start accumulating that so that on February 8th, we can have that, Again, I am not in any rush. So I don't want to add additional pressure to this as though we're under some, preconceived time frame. We will have the open session on February 22nd. I think that would be valuable. By that time, we'll have sent out notices and reminders about the 8th and the 22nd. And, however, the discussion can be summarized in terms of the direction that we're moving towards, which could help facilitate comments and suggestions. So come the 22nd, again, people can attend, people can send in their comments, whatever the format should be. And then I think we pause. I mean, I think we get a sense where we're at the end of February 22nd. And if there's a general feeling amongst everybody that, we're kind of on the right track, we have language and process, and we've touched the basis, then maybe we can move towards March, whenever our first meeting is on March. If not, we'll go. So I think it was a productive afternoon or productive morning, and thank you all for attending. So happy New Year. Okay, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.